Okay, just picture this for a second. The military of one country rolls into another and arrests its sitting president. I mean, it sounds like something straight out of an action movie, right? But what if it were real? Today, we're going to unpack a wild scenario that really pushes the absolute limits of law, power, and, well, the entire international system. So, let's get into it.
This is the big question, isn't it? And on the surface, it seems pretty simple. But the answer? Oh man, the answer is a messy collision of conflicting laws, historical precedents, and some really tough geopolitical realities. It makes you ask, whose rules even apply when a nation does something this drastic?
So to make this tangible, we're going to use a very specific hypothetical. Let's imagine U.S. forces land in Venezuela and they seize President Nicolás Maduro to bring him to the U.S. to face criminal charges. Now, this isn't a prediction, okay? Think of it more as a stress test for the entire global order. And the very first thing that snaps is the law.
Right, so on one side, you've got these foundational rules that are supposed to dictate how countries behave with each other. And on the other side, you have this unique and pretty controversial idea within U.S. law. And, well, they say two completely different things.
You know, the absolute bedrock of international law is this idea of state sovereignty. The easiest way to think about it is like a you stay on your side of the fence, I'll stay on mine rule for the whole planet. It basically means what happens inside a country's borders is its own business, and other countries can't just barge in and interfere, especially not with military force. And this whole sovereignty idea extends directly to a country's leader. A sitting head of state has something called absolute immunity. Now, that's not to say they're above the law in their own country, but it's designed to stop other nations from using, say, politically motivated arrests to mess with a foreign government. It's meant to let leaders actually do their jobs without fear of being nabbed. But then there's this, the Ker-Frisbie doctrine. And this is a really fascinating and frankly controversial principle in American law. In a nutshell, it says, we don't really care how you got here. So even if a defendant was literally kidnapped from another country, totally violating international law, once they are physically standing inside a U.S. courtroom, the trial can go ahead. And this just perfectly lays out the clash. International law, especially that core rule in the UN Charter against invading another country, is crystal clear. This is illegal, full stop. But the U.S. Supreme Court has actually backed up its own doctrine. So get this, the act of capturing the person might be a huge international crime, but the trial itself could be seen as perfectly legal inside the U.S. It's a gigantic legal contradiction.
So, okay, we have this massive legal paradox. The act itself is illegal internationally, but the trial could happen domestically. Why on earth would a nation ever risk the global chaos to step into that kind of legal minefield? Well, the answer has less to do with the law itself and more to do with a growing crisis of credibility that's shaking up global politics.
To really get this, we need to understand two different types of credibility. First, there's threat credibility. Basically, do your enemies actually believe you'll use force when you say you will? And then there's promise credibility. Do people believe you'll actually deliver on a deal or a reward? And that distinction, it's everything.
I mean, when it comes to threat credibility, the U.S. record since the Cold War has been pretty unambiguous. From Kuwait to Kosovo, Afghanistan to Iraq, and the whole campaign against ISIS, the message has been sent loud and clear. When the U.S. threatens military action, it is not a bluff, and adversaries know it.
But now, look at the other side of the coin. Promise credibility. In North Korea, promised aid and reactors in the 90s, they never really showed up. In Libya, Muammar Gaddafi gave up all of his weapons programs for a better relationship, only to be overthrown with NATO's help a few years later. And then Iran. The U.S. just walked away from the nuclear deal even when international inspectors were saying Iran was holding up its end of the bargain. So here's the crucial point. While the American stick is seen as very, very real, the carrot is seen as, well, pretty unreliable. And when diplomacy, which is the art of the promise, breaks down, countries can get pushed toward more extreme, forceful options.
And this credibility gap, it creates a massive problem for diplomats who are just trying to solve conflicts. It leads to this fundamental dilemma, where you're pitting the desire for justice against the absolute need for peace.
This quote just nails it. I mean, think about it. If you're a leader and you believe that stepping down or signing some peace deal is just going to lead to you being arrested and put on trial, why would you ever agree to it? The threat of prosecution basically kills any incentive to even come to the negotiating table.
So that's the impossible question for any diplomat, right? You really can't do both at the same time. Going after a foreign leader with a criminal indictment might feel like justice, but it pretty much slams the door shut on negotiating a peaceful end to a conflict with that very same person. You have to pick a path.
Let's look at a real-world example of this exact choice. This timeline from the peace process in Afghanistan shows a clear decision to put peace ahead of justice. A warlord who was implicated in absolutely horrific war crimes was given amnesty just to bring him to the table. A few years later, thousands of Taliban prisoners were released just to get talks started. Look, these were hugely controversial decisions, but they show a moment where justice was deliberately set aside in the hope, however faint, of achieving peace.
So, a world where a great power's promises are doubted and its legal actions are so contested, that world doesn't just stay the same. This crisis of credibility is actually speeding up some fundamental changes to the whole global system.
You know the saying, nature abhors a vacuum? Well, so does geopolitics. When the established leader of the international system, the US, is seen as less reliable, and its main challenger, China, has its own credibility problems, it creates a kind of power vacuum, and other countries and other forces are stepping right in to fill that void. Analysts are seeing three big consequences pop up. First, you've got the rise of what they call geopolitical swing states. Countries like India or Brazil or Saudi Arabia, who aren't really picking a side. Instead, they're playing all sides to push their own interests. Second, we're seeing a world of these flexible, shifting alliances, where new groups form around specific issues, because the old big institutions just feel kind of slow and ineffective. And third, something called a global governance deficit. That's a fancy way of saying the trust you need to tackle huge global problems, like climate change or pandemics, just isn't there anymore. So we get stuck in gridlock.
And all of this brings us right back to where we started with that crazy scenario. When the rules of the game are contested, when promises are broken, and when that basic layer of trust just evaporates, does the whole international system just revert to a more primitive state? One where raw power is the only thing that matters? And the question is no longer, is it legal, but simply, can you get away with it? That's the question this credibility crisis is forcing all of us to face.